poetry lovers, welcome to my channel Bella Poetry. My name is Bella and I love beautiful poetry. In this segment, we will discuss the life and the works of another famous 19th century female poet, Emily Brontë. Emily Brontë was actually a famous novelist that penned a world-famous novel, Wuthering Heights, the only one she's written, and not everybody knows that she actually authored also 200 beautiful poems. Emily Brontë was born in 1818 in Thornton, England. Her father was Patrick and her mother was Maria Brontë. Patrick was an Irishman who used to be a blacksmith apprentice, very poor, and then he became a teacher, got a scholarship to Cambridge University, and later became a perpetual curate at St. Michael's and All Saints Church in Haworth, England in 1820. And so the family, Patrick and Maria, moved to this remote place on the edge of Yorkshire moors. They had 6 children in a very quick succession. The first one to be born was Maria, then came Charlotte, then Elizabeth, then their only son, Branwell. The 5th child was Emily, and then came her youngest sister, Anne. But unfortunately, in 1821, Emily's mom, Maria, passed away from cancer. Emily was only 3 years old at that time. So Patrick tried to find a suitable partner to help him take care of the children, but he couldn't. So Maria's sister, Elizabeth Branwell, came to live with the family. And she lived there until 1842 when she passed away from intestinal obstruction. Emily was 6 years old when the father decided to send Maria, Charlotte, Elizabeth, and her to a school for the daughters of clergy. And the school was extremely cold, soulless, and unsanitary place. And so the 2 daughters, Maria and Elizabeth, got very, very sick. They came back home and unfortunately passed away in 1825 from tuberculosis. So the father went back to the school and he brought his other 2 daughters, Charlotte and Emily, home and decided to homeschool all the children. Education was very important for Patrick because he did not have inheritance. He didn't have land to give to their children after his death. So he wanted to make sure that all his daughters, not just his son Branwell, but all his daughters were well educated. So Elizabeth Branwell, their aunt, was responsible for teaching them domestic skills and discipline and order. And Patrick, who by all accounts was a very warm and loving father, gave them a wonderful liberal education. He taught them literature. There were a lot of books in the house. Emily studied music and languages and literature. And she was a very shy child. All the daughters were very shy, but Emily was considered the shyest. Many times when guests came to visit, she would hide under the table and she refused to speak to people. She did not like small talk. She loved to go out and walk in the Yorkshire moors. She loved nature. Emily loved to draw. She loved to sketch birds, and she loved animals. The family had a few dogs, and Emily had a mastiff who was extremely aggressive, and Emily was actually the only one who could control him. One time, a rabid dog bit Emily, and she used a hot poker from a fireplace to sear her flesh in order not to get an infection because she didn't want to disturb other family members. When Branwell was 9 years old, he received a birthday gift, a box of little toy soldiers. Now this tiny box, this box of tiny soldiers, ignited the children's imagination, and Branwell and his sister Charlotte started to write. They created this imaginary land called Angria, and they drew maps, they created characters, they made magazines in which they wrote stories and poems about their imaginary land. And they even wrote in this tiny handwriting as if the tiny soldiers were the ones writing the stories. But when Emily turned 13, she and her sister Anne started to write about their own imaginary island called Gondel, and also did the same thing with stories and poetry. They were so involved in the stories, and they actually continued writing them into their adulthood. So when Emily turned 17 years old, she went to a girls' school, Roe Head, where her sister Charlotte was a teacher. But she didn't last long there because she became very, very homesick. Emily was not used to restrictions and to routine and schedules. She loved to be free. And actually, Charlotte commented that liberty, freedom was extremely, extremely important to Emily. She was maybe reclusive, but she was also extremely smart and extremely independent. So finally, Charlotte decided to send Emily home. And Emily, played piano at home. For 3 years, she stayed at home. She played piano, she wrote poetry, and she took care of household chores. When Emily turned 20 in 1838, she decided to become a teacher in Halifax. But that also didn't work out because she didn't like the long working hours. She had to work 17 hours a day, which was very, very hard on her. So again, she returned home. But in 1841, Charlotte and Emily decided to go to a school in Brussels. It was a school for Roman Catholics of Belgium, and they decided that they want to learn French and German. They gave English lessons in exchange for board, and they excelled actually in languages so much that the principal of the school asked Emily to stay on and to teach French. But suddenly in 1842, their aunt Elizabeth Branwell passed away, and they had to return home to take care of the household and their father. In 1844, they wanted to open their own school, but unfortunately, they didn't have even one applicant because the location was so remote. So that idea also kind of failed. So now Emily continued to write poetry, and in 1845, Charlotte found her 2 books of poetry that Emily compiled. One book was filled with poems about Gondel, the imaginary island, and the other book of poetry was filled with all kinds of different loose poems that Emily had written in a few years prior. And so Charlotte was really impressed by Emily's poetry, and she told Emily about it, but Emily became enraged and she said, "I didn't give you permission to read my poetry." She became very angry. But then Charlotte revealed to her that she also writes poetry, and so does her sister Anne. So the 3 girls decided to put their poetry together in a book they called Poems by Curie, Alice, and Acton Bell. They actually took pen names with male names because it was easier to publish. Although they actually published the books on their own and they paid £50 to publish the books, but unfortunately only 2 copies sold. So that was it for this project. Emily decided to leave the poetry aside and to devote all her time to writing her one and only novel, Wuthering Heights. Now, in spite of the fact that historians have no idea, they really think that Emily didn't have any romantic involvements. She didn't know what love or passion was. She never got married, never had children. But at the same time, she wrote this amazing novel, which was filled with twisted and even frightening love and strange relationships. And the reviews for this novel were quite mixed. Some critics loved it, but some really hated it. The novel itself became famous after 1880, a few decades after Emily's death. And now it's considered one of the classics. So this novel was published in 1847. Charlotte Brontë published her novel Jane Eyre, and then Anne Brontë published her novel Agnes Grey. So all three sisters were very good novelists. Unfortunately, their brother Branwell, he came back home in 1845. He was using opium and he also drank a lot. He became very sick and passed away in 1848. Emily was heartbroken. She loved her siblings. This was her one and favorite brother. She went to his funeral, and at the funeral she got sick. She actually didn't tell anybody that she was not feeling well. She continued to do her household chores until the sisters noticed that she looked emaciated and sickly and feverish, and they wanted to bring a doctor, but Emily, who was very stubborn, very headstrong, refused, and she passed away on December 19th, 1848. A few months after that, Anne got sick with tuberculosis, just like Emily and Branwell, and she passed away in 1849. The last surviving sister, Charlotte, got married to somebody called Arthur Bell, who was also an Englishman. And in the beginning, she didn't love him, but then she kind of started to have feelings for him. She got pregnant, but the pregnancy made her very sick. And unfortunately, she passed away as well at the age of 39 in 1855. So their poor father, Patrick, buried all his children, and he himself passed away 6 years later in 1861 at the age of 84. Really very sad and very tragic story. I wanted to read to you a few quotes by Emily Brontë and then a couple of poems. So the first quote is, "Proud people breed sad sorrows for themselves." Pride was considered one of the 7 sins in Christianity. "Any relic of the dead is precious if they were valued living." In other words, if you had a good life, if you were virtuous during your lifetime, then your relics will be important as well. "Honest people don't hide their deeds." So this is just 3 of Emily Bronte's quotes. And now we will read a couple of her poems, a few of her poems. "What winter floods, what winter floods, what showers of spring, what have drenched the grass by night and day, and yet beneath that spectre ring, unmoved and undiscovered lay, a mute remembrancer of crime, long lost, concealed, forgot for years. It comes at last to cancel time and waken unavailing tears." Beautiful. "Moonlight, summer moonlight. 'Tis moonlight, summer moonlight, all soft and still and fair. The solemn hour of midnight breathes sweet thoughts everywhere. but most where trees are sending their breezy boughs on high, or stooping low are lending a shelter from the sky. And there in those wild bowers a lovely form is laid, green grass and dew-steeped flowers wave gently round her head. And the last poem is called I Know Not How It Falls on Me. I know not how it falls on me, the summer evening hushed and lone. Yet the faint wind comes soothingly with something of an olden tone. Forgive me if I shunned so long your gentle greeting, earth and air, but sorrow withers even the strong, and who can fight against despair? Beautiful and melancholy poem. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for visiting my channel. Please be back again, and don't forget to press the subscribe button so you will receive more segments of poetry in the future. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.